everyone, and welcome to Speakers Bank Podcast, Our Voices, Our Views, regular podcast edition. I'm Annika, together with my teammates Georgia and Billy from Victoria University, and we'll be facilitating this episode. If you could please welcome Nathan, Storm, and Catherine, and we're going to discuss common myths and misconceptions around disabilities. So join us as we explore issues around this, and let's get started. So I guess first question today, what we wanted to touch on was, what are some common myths and misconceptions that you have heard about people with disabilities? Anyone?
With me, when because I'm so independent and my disability is kind of not visible, I get given that you don't look like you have a disability, which should be a no-no. You shouldn't, because that puts a plug on that person, and then that kind of stops them from explaining what their disability is. It's like they look at, yes, it's good. You want to be treated equal, but same thing, you do have a disability. And people need to learn about those needs, because if you went into something and you need support, how are they meant to know how to support you?
A common misconception is that I will always need help. That is true, but there are some tasks where you need to let the person actually be themselves and try to let them do it. As much as it's hard to sit back and watch someone really struggle, sometimes it's best to ask before invading their personal space and telling them, do you need help? What the correct procedure should be is that if I need someone's help, I will ask for help.
Mm-hmm.
And it's up to the person with the disability to decide when and if that, it should be applied. Because if a stranger comes up to you and helps you, it can be a good thing, but it can give you a low sense of self-confidence that you can't actually do it. So you need to be able to give it a go before you have to ask the "can you help me" type scenario, which can be very awkward at times. But it has to be done in some situations.
But independence, yeah? So you can
independence.
And going back to Catherine's one too, I think that's a big one where not everyone, but it is a real common misconception that all disabilities are visible when a lot aren't visible.
Yeah, and those are the ones that are very tricky. Because you could look at a person and go, he doesn't have crutches or she doesn't have crutches, so that means she doesn't have a disability. I mean, how do you know that for sure? Because you never met that person. You don't even know that person. So you're making an assumption that this is what I've already come to the conclusion without even asking that person. So
yeah, that's so true. I get a lot when people see Philip just sitting with his legs crossed like a real adult and his hands crossed, they assume that there's nothing, there's no disabilities there. But then when he starts to move and certain actions that he does, then they go, oh. But they're just judging a book by its cover to start with, without even, waiting or stepping aside and going, give him a chance.
Another thing is, when you're in class, and then I'm in a class with other adults with disabilities, we're all at different levels. Like, there's a few independent ones. Like, we can work, we can whatever. But what I don't like, and it shouldn't happen, is the helper just kind of shows you what you need to do without you asking for help.
Mm-hmm.
You as you said, Storm, we need to ask when we do need help.
Yeah.
That's very important, because if you can do it, then do it. We
I
don't
think
we don't need to be shown unless
Or also that person, if they're aware that there is a room full of people with certain levels of disabilities, they should actually be asking, would you like some help?
yes.
Yeah.
Rather than assuming that you want it straight away or you don't want it. They should be asking you like any other person would be asked if they need help.
Yeah.
I've personally noticed, especially since using a wheelchair more, that people actually treat me different in public when I'm walking around with, sticks or just furniture compared to using a wheelchair. So when I'm walking around, people will treat me, for the most part, I guess you could say in quotes, normally, like I'm just any other person. But when I'm in a wheelchair, I find that I almost get spoken to as if I'm like mentally slow or not there. And oftentimes, like if I go into a store, people will want to speak to my wife and not to me, even if I'm the one there to deal with the person. Yeah, it really is. And or like you get, people that assume that the biggest one for me that I've noticed even well before I was ever married was the fact that people seem to assume, well, if you're disabled, you're not capable of a relationship. And by default, it's not just the public that assume this, it's places like the NDIS, the people like the CPA that organised September. They will literally, when you go to fill in a survey, you'll get like family, family member, friend, or other. You won't get, spouse or partner. So
very interesting that you said that, because companies of that nature, like NDIS and September, should be more aware that they are working for people with disabilities and should have background education and and better procedures on how they talk.
I mean, and it's like I've said, Storm, in past podcasts, you will literally get people that assume that people with, disabilities, and I think especially guys assume this about guys, is that we are incapable of romance or sexual relations or anything of that nature. So it's just like people assume, well, if you can't walk, you're either not mentally there or, you're not able to live a life that anyone else would. And the reality is it's like, for example, being denied for SDA. I believe one of the biggest barriers is that the NDIS basically goes, well, you have your wife, therefore it's almost like they're trying to say, we want to punish you for being married and living like everybody else. Like, it's one thing when the NDIS will turn around and say, okay, well, for certain things, if you're a parent, you're responsible for limited things. I understand that to a certain degree, but there's a line where it's like, well, okay, but my wife, married me, whereas a parent to some degree has an obligation to, take care of their child to an extent. So at the end of the day, there's got to be a line where, people have got to understand that, that the misconception has to, leave out of people's minds that, I'm entitled to be equal with society, even if I am, married, or even if you are, single. You don't just want to be, stuck in an SDA shared home. And
another common myth that I found was people with disabilities have the same sort of level of disabilities. For example, with cerebral palsy, I can relate to it. They think that all people with cerebral palsy are mentally unintelligent, or they have walking problems. Sometimes with cerebral palsy, it's only a mild walking problem, and that's the reason why they can walk. For people like me and Nathan, we have major difficulties in the walking pattern, because that's where the CP has unfortunately affected our bodies. So it depends on the level of disability you get from the day that you're born with our condition.
And the thing is, Storm, there are literally people on TikTok. I remember my wife came across.
Sorry, Billy.
Who?
Oh, that's all.
That's right. Had a perfect walking pattern, and she was perfectly stable. Had CP, but her speech was terrible. So there's no two people with CP are exactly alike. Like I noticed, Storm, even when we used to walk through the hallway together in the offices, your walking pattern is completely different to mine, for example, even though the degree of disability may be very similar.
Absolutely.
Like,
Sorry.
with CP, there's all different levels, and CP affects different parts of someone's body, and and people with an intellectual disability, the needs are different again. Like, I know a friend of mine can't read or write properly. I can. I may not navigate instructions clear. Like how I like to say it within people's needs are we're all individual. We're all different. And, but, you know, being human as well. And people need to see the person. Like, some people are nonverbal, some people have struggling, you know, all that kind of stuff. But look at the person, because we can talk. We're still people. Like, if you had a support worker with you, doesn't mean that this person, I mean, if you had a support worker with you and then this person talks to them, speak out. You can talk to me, like, I'm just you know, I'm here, kind of thing.
Yeah.
Be like, so.
And just on that, Catherine, the best thing that my wife will often do if we go somewhere and she has the feeling that someone may, you know, talk to her instead of me, she'll actually walk away and go and look at something else, because it actually forces the person to acknowledge me.
Yes, and that's very important. And we need to show that to them, that we can talk as well. Whether you're in a chair or not in a chair, we're still human. You know, we're not like any different than anyone else. We're just, yeah.
Another common myth or misconception is that people with disabilities do not know when they've been taken advantage of. That is not true. We know when you are pulling a fast one. We know when you're not treating us with the respect and tolerance that we deserve. So that's the other one that people don't understand. Because sometimes when I talk to people, my level of conversation amazes them, and they're like, well, you, Storm, don't seem like you have a disability, but I do. Just because I can understand someone doesn't mean I don't have a disability. I still have a disability. It's just that you've got in your head what a particular person with a disability looks like, and 99.9% of it is because you've only experienced that form of disability.
I find it's all about assumptions. Everybody assumes that's the magic word. It's always assuming of that individual, but it shouldn't be that way.
I mean, I will build on that with Billy and be like, sometimes it's assumptions that they've taken. So they have someone told them bad information at the beginning, and they've just run with that their whole life. Like one that dyslexics get all the time is that they can't read at all. That dyslexics can't read at all. And the weird thing is, you see that perpetuated all over media and like entertainment, but that's not true. And so people like take the bad info and they run with it. And you're like, what? No.
No.
And they forget that all these disabilities present differently within every individual. Like you said, it's not every person is the exact same. It's going to present differently in every person. One person might excel in another area, whereas they have difficulties in another, where next person could be the total opposite.
I just wanted to ask the panel a question. Do you think it's from bad experiences and bad parenting that the misconceptions follow from the bad?
I feel personally it's a lack of educating the wider society or wider community or society as a whole. It's there's not enough education out there on every platform that can be used. It's narrowed down to certain platforms. I mean, you know, you think about the what we had our podcast on last week, you know, the International Day for People with a Disability. I mean, how many platforms have you seen that advertised on?
Yeah, none.
I've only seen it on the Vic Uni VU web as an email, actually.
And if they implemented these kind of things in schools, even just dedicating that one day a year could make the world of difference.
Yeah.
But I think this question also that you asked us, Storm, was something we wanted to ask you guys too, and ties into our next one.
Another thing, an idea I would like to do, and I can just picture it, is when we actually speak at a school, I would like to see if any of these children, like if we spoke at a big whole school assembly, and I want to, like, because a lot of children still are struggling with friendships in school because they have a disability. My idea is, can we organise, like, get some children if they want to stand up, or even if we spoke at a classroom, who in the class has learning difficulties? The polite way of, you know, not using disability, but difficulties.
And I would say,
and
you would have a lot of, sorry, Catherine, you would have a lot of children putting their hand up for that, because there's a lot of kids with learning disabilities.
Yeah,
mainstream school.
And and if they put their hand up, I would like to say something like, who would like to, I don't know how to put it out, who would like to
share their experience?
Share
their experience
to your class, because they may not know how to talk, because that might give them, because if they see us talking about our disabilities, that might give them confidence to share their, you know, teaching their classmates about them a little bit and a bit more understanding.
Yeah, because I've got the feeling that when I was back at school, I got bullied because the kids didn't really understand me. So the whole purpose of my leadership skills was to sort of break down those common myths and misconceptions of my disability and people with disabilities in general, and then that way I could teach them. But I feel like that's the school's job as well, not just my job to do that. Because you like Catherine said, you can't be 100% sure that each kid or child is going to take the correct information in. They could just be on another planet while you're talking.
You would also see in a school scenario that children who have grown up in a family home with somebody in their immediate family that they live under the same roof have disabilities, whether it be CP or developmental delay or whatever, or even autism, those children are more in tune and can understand disability as a whole, whereas the other children don't understand it. So that's where the schools need to educate all kids in disability, to give them the knowledge or at least some minimal knowledge of disabilities, one word for many, many, many conditions.
I mean, if Georgia had that little level of education about her condition, her upbringing would have been a lot better. So same with mine. If my school had better education in terms of cerebral palsy, then we wouldn't have much bullying impact. Yes, it makes a person stronger. We get that, and we appreciate life more. But at the same time, you don't want to be in that scenario week in and week out.
And guys, can I ask, sorry, why do you think, so you asked why we think people might have these misconceptions and buy into these myths. Why do you think? Do you have any suggestions or ideas on why you think they might?
I think because no one actually challenges the myths. No one actually stands up in our corner and says, "Hey, this is wrong." We just acknowledge that was right without really contesting that it was right. I think nowadays it's more different because we're more open and honest with each other. But back then, it was more harder to do. I'm not saying it still happens, because it does happen, but I feel like more people are willing to challenge that myth or conception about certain things about disabilities. So I don't know what Nathan thinks, but that's my point of view on that one.
I think that there are some people that are doing that, Storm, but I think the biggest thing so I think there's been a downward trend not only in the level of, care and respect that those with disabilities get, but I've noticed that society has become actually, and go with me here when I say this, less inclusive of those with disabilities. Think about this, and I mean no disrespect to anyone who has ever had a car accident or had a spinal cord injury or anything like this, but this is just what I observe, right? If you get someone with, say, a spinal injury, whether that be a car accident or some kind of accident, they will be treated better generally by the NDIS and other organisations than someone like myself who comes along and says, "Hey, I can't help my condition. I had it from birth," but I will usually get less services, less funding than someone who, as a teenager, drove drunk and, injured their, spinal cord, for example. And it'll get to the point where with those people, the government will actually pay for, rehabilitation and different services and things. But yet on my end, it's like, I'll be lucky if I can squeeze, for example, 140,000 out of the NDIS for my entire plan. Yet there'll be people that have spinal cord injuries that might get over and above that. Or there'll be people with autism with the same thing. And it's not to say, I'm not suggesting in saying that they don't deserve that, but what I am saying is I see a real shift in society where it's like, we'll punish the person that had the condition they couldn't help and had no control over, but we'll reward, the person, for example, that got their disability due to, say, for example, an accident. And that's where I think society is actually having a downward trend, because what you have then coupled with that is the political correctness, where people say, "Oh, well, you can't say disabled anymore, you have to say differently abled." And that's where you actually fuel the misconceptions, because nobody wants to ask anything. People tread on eggshells. And then when you start perpetuating differently abled, people then tend to think, well, you may not really have a disability, you're just differently abled. So it's just that it's not that you need any help or you can't do it at all. You've just got to do it in a different way, which isn't necessarily true. There are things in my life that I cannot do at all. It's not that I'm differently abled. It's like, I have a disability. At the end of the day, I am damaged, and I acknowledge that, but there are people that don't want to.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think it's because they're trying to protect themselves, and that's the reason why they don't want to acknowledge it. But my opinion is, if you acknowledge it, then it becomes easier over time. Like when I was a lot younger, I didn't have the ability to acknowledge that I had a disability. I hated my disability.
Me too.
But you got to understand that disability is a part of you, and it's going to be forever part of you. And you're never going to get rid of that, no matter how hard you try, no matter how many exercise programs, no matter how many treatments you go through. You're always going to have it. It's a part of you. So just accept it and embrace it. Embrace it.
Like you, Storm, I absolutely hated it, and I used to say so many negative things, but it's gotten a lot better. I mean, well, you have your days where you think you have to get with you. Like I say to myself, you have to get rid of your disability, it's unacceptable, all that blah, blah, blah. But it's not true because, as you said, it's part of you.
Yeah.
And we have to learn to accept it and be positive
Yeah.
about it. And
Yeah.
teach those that, like, it's okay. Like, you're so, you know, there's your strengths where you can do things, there's weaknesses where you can't and where you need help.
Yeah.
But the thing is, you know, we can do things independently and not let people talk us down on our needs.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And what I find is the problem with being politically correct is that the people that generally think they're shielding us by saying, or by protecting us from words like handicapped or, you know, disabled, and kind of being, I guess, offended for us. What it's actually doing is, this is just my view, right? But my view is that they're not actually protecting me. They're actually almost making the people that have, fueling the people that have these misconceptions to dilute it more, so that we actually have the opposite effect and become less inclusive. Because when you look at businesses, for example, as much as I technically have, there are rights that I technically have, but not all people or companies actually, you know, cater for people with disabilities as much as they should. It's like, for pure example, I was waiting somewhere for my wife one day, and someone said, "Oh, is that your mother?" Or I've recently had an issue with trying to get legal representation for a QCAT hearing, and I'm saying to them, well, I have a cognitive impairment on top of my disability, and there's no wiggle room to go, okay, well, because you have a disability, we'll get someone to speak on your behalf if that's your wishes. It's almost like, well, you know, we have to treat you just like everybody else, but there's got to be a balance.
That's nuts.
Like take into extra consideration some of the...
Sometimes I need someone to talk on my behalf if I can't do it myself. But, like, I can make certain appointments on my own, going to the appointments on my own independently. If it's hard and I don't understand the information the person is giving me, I will need someone to go with. But that's not all the time. That's just...
No.
I know the stigma in the community with people with special needs is they don't want to be labelled, but like we've been pointing out, the reality is you have a disability, and that's never going to go away, no matter how hard you try. I mean, yes, there could be a miracle from, you know, God, or a miracle from science, or whatever it is that could help you with your disability, but at the end of the day, we've got to live with what we've got to live, and that's the reality.
And when you think about guardianship, for example, Storm, there are two ends of the spectrum. So, for example, there are times when I have to deal with, you know, companies and commerce like everybody else does, right? But the problem is there is nothing that is between a power of attorney and a guardianship, because basically what a lot of companies like to do is they want, for example, they either want me to speak for myself and for someone to have limited authority, but it's only company based. What my wife has often said to me, what would be good is having something between a guardianship and a power of attorney, where, for example, my wife can speak on my behalf, even though technically on paper I would still have all my rights and be considered completely independent. You need something in between where, like, say, for example, if I'm signing up for a phone plan, my wife could, you know, intervene in the store or on the phone if I'm struggling cognitively. But there's nothing in between. It's either, well, your wife does it all, but we take all your rights away as if you're dependent, or you do it all and it's up to the company as to whether they give your wife, you know, authority to speak on your behalf. There's no in between.
What the company should say is that they should do it like this. The carer or wife, in your case, Nathan, should be treated as an extension of yourself, rather than as an individual, because at the end of the day, they're the ones that are going to be responsible for things that are going to happen that's out of your control or in anyone else's control if they have a special needs condition. So I totally don't understand what companies are thinking like that.
And that's where in this world the government's still either or. But again, I completely agree with you, Storm. But that's where the misconception is that it's either you can do it all yourself or you can do none of it. There's no in between, because what my wife is essentially wanting is just something signed to say that in the event that I'm cognitively struggling or I have a day or I'm tired, my wife can just take over and a company or a bank can't dispute it.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it's like you want your wife to advocate for you for the things that you don't really have the energy for or just have problems with.
Yeah, because
as well. Sorry. How do you think though that these myths and misconceptions impact those with disabilities? So that's something that you're facing at the moment, where you say it's either all or nothing pretty much.
Yeah.
And then this is a flow-on effect. Are there any other impacts that you can think of within
I think when it comes to myths and misconceptions, I think the biggest misconception is like, okay, so for example, I don't want anybody else other than my wife to shower or dress me due to PTSD, right? The problem with, for example, the laws or the acts around disability rights is that they are so overprotective, though, to the point where if I was in a situation where I really had nobody else to shower me and I didn't want anyone else to do it, they can get to the point where they could force me to do something that I didn't want against my will, and basically declare me as far as to my knowledge, I may be completely wrong, just bear that in mind. But as far as my understanding is, there are laws in there that could basically be enacted if I was deemed to be mentally insane. And that's purely because I have literally said to people, rather than be put in a situation where I would be triggered by PTSD, I would almost rather die, because the feeling is worse than death. Now, to anybody else, that sounds insane, but the reality is, it's like when my wife and I have discussed it, the reality is I say that with full capacity, knowing that I'm actually not insane, and that I know and have full knowledge that what I'm actually saying is I am that desperate to avoid setting off my triggers that I'm willing to almost sacrifice my own life or quality of care in order to protect myself.
And people who haven't had PTSD wouldn't understand that, but with that experience that Nathan has had, that's the extreme lengths that people do to avoid that sort of like trigger. So you completely understand from that point of view. It's not that he's crazy, it's just the reality of the situation.
Yeah,
because it's got to that point.
Can I add on something here? Is that I'm getting a sort of sense that everyone's like a little exhausted by having to constantly educate everyone around you about like the misconceptions and busting down walls. Because speaking from personal experience, I've done a lot of research on dyslexia, and I'm constantly having to tell people like bust myths and say, no, I can do that, I can read, blah, 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 all this stuff. And it does get frustratingly
Very frustrating.
Always having to be like, no, you're wrong, this is a thing. And I even go so far to have learnt statistics about dyslexia in Australia. So, for instance, did you guys know that 1 in 8 Australians is dyslexic? From a 2014 Sydney Institute study on dyslexia. Not a lot of people know that. But that's the thing. It's constant amounts of like bombarding everyone else around them to learn something.
That's why I said it's all about educating. It's all about, getting together all the organisations that deal with disability that are able to advocate, go out there, be the voice. It's educate, or train. And the more it's done, and yes, there's going to be challenges across the board for everything when it comes to disability, and whatever level of disability and whatever disability the individuals have. But it's all about educating and educating.
Treating people equal.
Equal, but this is what I mean. You know, society can't treat people with disability equally. There are certain organisations can't, like Nathan was saying, like for the telephone, for instance, that provider, because their staff are not trained and not educated on people with a disability. You know, I mean, the world's big out there, but I just, at the end of the day, the only way I reckon you could combat that is to keep educating, pushing.
You know, one of the frustrating things, Billy, that came out of this COVID situation is that we as a community and we as a society of people with special needs and carers were the last group to even be thought of during the COVID. I only had one checkup for the entire time that we were in the COVID. One checkup, and it wasn't even with the group that I'm in. It was with another group. And it was just so frustrating. It's like, am I a person or am I just a number? And that's what I felt like.
It's like you've been forgotten, and I understand that because Philip can't voice how he feels and opinions that he needs to, you know. And if he tries, it's going to be very limited. So that's why I'm here, and I can understand all of that. It's like I put myself in my son's skin, and I know how it feels. And it's very, very, very frustrating. Now, if it wasn't for me advocating and me pushing, he wouldn't have regular appointments that he needs to have. They wouldn't have even called me up to have the COVID jab at the hospital, because I would have to go to a GP or a drive-through or whatever they set up, which is not possible because he needs to be sedated for it. All these things, you know, but individuals that aren't savvy or have any sort of background knowledge or lived experiences with disability would be none the wiser.
That's the thing too. I think a lot of us, well, personally, like my interactions with those with disabilities has been very limited. Like in primary school, those with disabilities were in our classroom. So we interacted, we were in classes together, they had a teacher aide, but they were still included in everything. Whereas you get to high school, they were separated from the regular classrooms. They had own classrooms. They weren't in the same area. So interaction was limited. People I know with disabilities was limited.
I did a different program to my classmates. I went to mainstream. I did a different program to my classmates because my needs couldn't do the main work. But I was still in the classroom at times with my classmates, but did different work. And a lot of activities with my integration aid, like my teachers' lunches. That was my maths. I went and volunteered at the childcare. That was more like, you know, and all that kind of stuff, working in the community.
I had a very similar experience, but not quite to Catherine's level. I decided when I was at year 10 and year 11, year 12, I wasn't going to do mainstream schooling. I was going to do the VCAL because I didn't see the point of having having the, I think it's called the Enter School, where they give you that for your university point.
Yeah, that's your ATAR,
Yeah, your ATAR. I didn't see any point in that. And I think schools just absolutely 100%, they bombard you with that ATAR score like it's the end of the world. And I'm just like, no, it's not. It's not the end of the world if you don't get it, because there's other ways to get what you want.
And I just want to put it out there. This is a bit of an education to support workers. When we're in groups, everyone's got different needs. So in my class, there's this worker working with, you know, whatever, and I try and have a discussion just like not, you know, normal people, and he might be he talks in front of, you know, whatever, but that's okay. You can talk in front of people. But then someone like us might come along and then he will say there's the difference between a staff and you. And that really, and it's like, that really made me think, okay. It's that, it really puts you into a funny perspective, like a staff, you, and the person with a disability. Like, he's putting you and us completely differently.
He's labeling you as a person.
That's a no-no.
That's a no-no.
Someone like us, that's what I mean by treating equal. Like some people with disability need a lot more care. Like some people on the spectrum, their mind might be in a child, whatever, an adult, but some like us are just can have that kind of
and I think
that is a very tricky topic, but there needs to be a lot more education within the disability sector.
And also, even when children go to mainstream school, this is where the problem is in educating. So how can I say? There's not enough resources. There's human resources to have the education in mainstream or private schools. And if they don't have enough of the human resources, they can't get children with disabilities in their classrooms. Because wouldn't it be lovely, even if they were learning at a different level or completely different level, but their surroundings are in a normal classroom?
That would be a dream come true.
Yeah, but it's the human resources that they don't have to do that. Because I've tried to get Philip, I got him in mainstream kinder, 12 hours a week, and it was so rewarding seeing the children around him without disabilities actually learning how to be around another young boy with disabilities, how to deal with his actions, if he got too close in their space, to look at a number on a top that they were wearing, for instance. So that was rewarding because it was educating those little kids from 3 to 4 years old how to deal with it, and that'll stay with them forever. So they'll have some sort of empathy and some sort of, in the back of their mind, oh, yeah, I remember when I had a little boy in my kinder class, that sort of thing. So if they did that everywhere else. But again, it's all to do with, and to get the human resources is a nightmare.
And
was there anything else before we wrapped up?
No, I think to summarise everything. I'm sorry, Nathan, go first.
No, I was just trying to say before, because earlier we were talking about, even the way the government handles people with disabilities. We look at, like, for example, our post-pandemic world, and I think Billy referenced even having to, potentially have to, knock Philip out to give him the vaccine, right? For example, in my situation, not only is there some hesitancy for my own personal reasons, but the reality is they are actually, I don't know what it's like in Melbourne, but they're actually starting to limit the services, even essential services now, that people with disabilities that are unvaccinated can access. And I think what government is failing to understand is during the pandemic, not only were we deemed by the Liberal government to not be eligible for the COVID payment because they don't see me as affected, well, I was, because I couldn't access the gym or any type of therapy, but it's to the point where they're now saying, well, it doesn't matter if you have PTSD around, medical things and the vaccine. We're basically going to say to you, we're going to say, well, you're not medically exempt. Whereas the reason I think they really need to work on that and widen that, and my wife and I have discussed this at length, is that, like I said to Storm before, everyone with a disability is different. So I have lung problems. So if that vaccine were to attack my lungs, it would make my lung function worse and I would die. From a carer perspective, my wife is all I have. If she were to take the vaccine and not know the risks and it killed her, or something happened to her and she became disabled herself, not only one or both of us would end up wasting away. So at some point too, in learning about disability and the misconceptions, the government can't keep fitting everyone in a box and say, all right, everybody has to have this. At some point, you've got to make exemptions for people that have legitimate reasons. Same with like the COVID payment. If I'd had the COVID, payment, it would have helped with my wife and I getting food. We couldn't get, along with other people with disabilities, we couldn't get food delivered for months because there was nothing at the shops and no Coles and Woolies weren't delivering.
Yeah, that puts a bit of a sticky situation, huh?
Yeah.
Well, look, I do want to thank you guys, Storm. It looks like Storm's gone. Storm, Catherine, Nathan, I learned a lot from you guys as usual today, but I think my key takeaways for this was that no two people with disabilities are the same. Everyone's different.
Well, absolutely.
Yeah, being inclusive though and education around disabilities definitely needs to be improved, and it plays a big role in busting these myths and misconceptions. But as much as we'd like to continue our conversation, our podcast episode has come to an end. Again, on behalf of Speakers Bank, thank you very much, guys, for sharing your insights about the topic.
You.
And thank you everyone for watching us. If you have any questions or suggestions on a topic that you want us to cover, contact us on 0396877066 or visit www.speakersbank.org.au. Again, I'm Annika together with my teammates Billy and Georgia saying thank you once again. Don't forget to subscribe to our Speakers Bank YouTube channel.
Don't forget to comment. And don't forget to comment either.
Oh, comment too, yes.
Comment
Facebook,
below.
Twitter, Instagram, LinkedIn. You have a great day. Thank you, guys.
Thank you.